The Same Mathematics, Different Meanings, My TSI-Stroke3B Curve&MyGPACurveForMITAdmissionPaart1, number 1712, the 11th of July 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, category, TSI and GPA. Preface for readers: eat more protein and fresh vegetables, eat less red meat and processed food, reduce food portions if overweight, eating a little less will not hurt you. Overeating for years will. Exercise every day, walk at least 7,000 to 8,000 steps daily, drink 100 oz to 0.5 to 3.0 liters of water each day. Sleep 6 to 7 hours every night. Manage stress, avoid emotionally draining people and unnecessary conflicts, put your health first. Wealth, fame, and power mean little without health and life. Preface: the idea for this paper came to me late one evening while reflecting on my recent 3-year TSI-Stroke3B trajectory. Suddenly, I remembered a conversation that took place more than 55 years ago when Professor Norman Jones reviewed my academic record before admitting me into the MIT doctoral program. He commented that my GPA trajectory was concave upward, recognizing it as evidence of continuous academic improvement. At that moment, I realized that my recent 3 years TSI-Stroke3B trajectory is also described by the same mathematical concept of concavity. However, the optimization objective is exactly the opposite. For my GPA, a concave upward trajectory represented success because higher academic performance was desirable. For my TSI-Stroke3B, a concave downward trajectory represents success because lower physiological risk is the objective. This difference arises from the different normalization conventions and optimization objectives of these two systems. That realization became the starting point of this paper. Two curves, separated by 54 years, describe two entirely different systems with opposite optimization objectives. Yet both are governed by exactly the same mathematical principle. This paper is my reflection on that remarkable comparison and connection. The attached figure diagrams demonstrate that mathematics itself is universal. What changes is not the mathematics, but the system being studied and used, the optimization objectives and rules, and the interpretation of the final results. Abstract: this paper presents a 3-year longitudinal analysis of my TSI-Stroke3B risk trajectory, spanning over 3 years from June 21, 2023 through July 11, 2026. This 3-year trajectory reveals a progressively concave upward evolution before my hemorrhagic stroke on June 21, 2025, followed by a concave downward recovery toward a lower and more stable operating state. During the observation period of 3 years, the TSI-Stroke3B trajectory reached a maximum value of 107.50, a minimum value of 89.20, with an overall average of 96.95. Representing a dynamic range of 18.31 TSI units. These observations quantitatively demonstrate the transition from progressive physiological risk of stroke accumulation before the stroke on June 21, 2025 to a lower-risk physiological state afterward. This study also illustrates a broader scientific principle. Around 54 years ago, Professor Norman Jones at MIT recognized my concave upward GPA trajectory from University of Iowa when admitting me into the MIT doctoral program. The GPA system is an additive model, whereas the TSI system is a multiplicative model. Therefore, the TSI is inherently more sensitive because unfavorable changes in one variable amplify the effects of the others, rather than simply adding to them. Today, I use exactly the same mathematical concept of concavity to interpret my TSI-Stroke3B trajectory. The mathematics has never changed, only the system, the optimization objective, and the interpretation have changed. This mathematical work demonstrates how mathematics, physics, and engineering systems thinking can provide valuable insights into understanding and managing complex living physiological systems through influence and sustained effort rather than direct control. The same systems principles can also be applied to both long-term academic development and health recovery. Introduction. One important observation emerged after I extended my TSI-Stroke3B trajectory from a 2-year period encompassing both before and after my stroke to a full 3-year observation period, spanning June 21, 2023 through July 11, 2026. The longer observation period transformed what had once appeared to be isolated fluctuations into the evolution of an entire pathophysiological system, viewed over a full 3-year period, rather than a 2-year pre- and post-stroke interval or the post-stroke year alone. The trajectory no longer represented a collection of individual data points. Instead, it revealed the evolution of an entire dynamic system over time. Instead, it revealed the long-term evolution of a living pathophysiological system as it gradually approached a critical transition, experienced a hemorrhagic stroke, and subsequently evolved toward a new physiological equilibrium situation. One interesting observation immediately came to mind. More than 54 years ago, Professor Norman Jones accepted me into the MIT doctoral program after reviewing my academic record from the University of Iowa. One of his comments has remained with me throughout my life. "Your GPA curve is concave upward, which is encouraging." At the time, this remark carried a very encouraging meaning. It indicated that my academic performance was improving at an accelerating rate. A concave upward trajectory reflected continuous acceleration in learning and academic achievement. As an undergraduate mathematics major of the time, I immediately understood exactly what he meant. Today, I find myself using exactly the same mathematical language to describe an entirely different system, a complex biomedical system associated with my recovery as a stroke survivor. My TSI-Stroke3B curve before the stroke is also concave upward. But this time the meaning is completely different. From an engineering perspective, it suggests a physiological system gradually accumulating internal stress and energy while approaching a critical operating state. After the stroke, the trajectory becomes concave downward as my pathophysiological condition gradually shifts toward a lower and more stable operating range. The mathematics has not changed. Only the system and its interpretation have changed. Method's TSI-Stroke3B model is based on three physiological variables: estimated average glucose EEG, systolic blood pressure SBP, and pulse pressure indicating the blood vascular stiffness PP equals SBP/dBP, to better represent long-term physiological evolution rather than short-term fluctuations. I analyzed the data using a 90-day moving average. The TSI-Stroke3B equation is defined as TSI-Stroke3B equals EEG 120 times SBP/dBP over 45 times SBP 120 times 200, where E equals estimated average glucose milligram (EL/SBP) equals systolic blood pressure mmHg/dBP equals diastolic blood pressure mmHg/pp equals pulse pressure equals SBP/dBP. The normalization constants 120 for 5120 and the amplification factor of 200 were selected to combine the three physiological variables into a single dimensionless systems index, rather than emphasizing any individual physiological measurement. The TSI-Stroke3B reflects the combined and multiplicative behavior of the overall physiological system. This stroke study analyzed approximately 3.05 years of continuous longitudinal data spanning June 21, 2023 through July 11, 2026. The use of a 90-day moving average allowed the long-term physiological trajectory to emerge while minimizing short-term daily fluctuations. Results viewed from an engineering systems perspective, the 3-year trajectory resembles the gradual accumulation of internal pathophysiological stress and energy, where energy is defined as the cumulative integration of interactions between the single output strain of stroke risk and 3 physiological input stressors over time. During the 2 years preceding my hemorrhagic stroke on June 21, 2025, the 90-day moving average TSI-Stroke3B curve exhibited progressively higher peaks and gradually evolved into a prolonged plateau before rupture occurred. From an engineering perspective, this pattern suggests the progressive accumulation of stroke risk energy within the underlying pathophysiological system. Following the stroke on June 21, 2025, the trajectory shifted downward and gradually stabilized at a lower operating level. The overall behavior resembles many engineering systems that progressively approach a critical transition and subsequently settle into a new equilibrium after the failure event. During the 3-year observation period, the TSI-Stroke3B curve reached a maximum daily value of 107.50 shortly before my hemorrhagic stroke. Even on the day of the stroke, June 21, 2025, the 90-day moving average TSI-Stroke3B remained elevated at approximately 103, reflecting a sustained high-risk pathophysiological state rather than a transient spike. During recovery after June 28, 2025, the index gradually declined to a minimum value of 89.20. With an overall 3-year average of 96.95. The resulting dynamic range of 18.31 units quantitatively illustrates the transition from progressive physiological risk accumulation before the stroke to a lower and more stable pathophysiological operating state afterward. One final observation occurred to him while reflecting on Professor Jones's comment about my concave upward GPA curve more than 54 years ago. The mathematics has never changed. What has changed is the meaning of the curve. For admission to MIT, a concave upward GPA trajectory was highly desirable because progressively higher academic performance reflected increasing achievement and learning potential. If I were a university-type professor selecting graduate students, I would also be more interested in a student with a strong concave upward trajectory than one whose transcript showed a perfect but flat record. A rapidly improving trajectory often reflects determination, resilience, and the capacity for continued growth. Throughout my career in the semiconductor and other high-tech industries, I worked with thousands of highly educated engineers, many holding PhD degrees from world-class universities. I learned that outstanding academic credentials alone did not necessarily predict long-term professional success. Technical intelligence is important, but sustained success also depends on continuous learning, persistence, communication skills, people skills, teamwork, business judgment, personal maturity, and selfishness, a warm heart, and the willingness and ability to work effectively with colleagues whose academic credentials may be less impressive than one's own. Those experiences reinforce my appreciation for trajectories of continuous growth rather than static snapshots of academic achievement. In contrast, for my TSI-Stroke3B trajectory, lower values represent lower physiological risk. Therefore, my objective is exactly the opposite: to maintain a long-term trajectory that continues moving downward rather than upward. The normalization standard has changed, but the underlying mathematics has not. In both cases, the curve simply describes the evolution of a system over time. The difference lies entirely in how the variable is interpreted. This realization once again reminds me that mathematics itself is universal, while the meaning of mathematics depends entirely upon the system being studied. Discussion. However, I also realize something equally important: I cannot directly control my TSI-Stroke3B value. The TSI-Stroke3B equation contains only three pathophysiological variables: estimated average glucose E, systolic blood pressure SBP, and pulse pressure PP. Therefore, the only practical way to improve that TSI-Stroke3B trajectory is to influence these three variables. However, these three variables cannot be controlled directly. They are influenced indirectly through multiple lifestyle factors and, when necessary, appropriate medications, such as Keppra for seizure control. Among the three variables, pulse pressure PP has been the most difficult for me to modify because it is closely associated with the aging process, similar to my dry age-related macular degeneration (AMD). Consequently, my daily efforts concentrate primarily on blood glucose and systolic blood pressure, and fortunately, even these two primary biomarkers cannot be controlled directly. They are themselves outputs of a much larger and more complex pathophysiological system. Blood glucose E and systolic blood pressure SBP are continuously influenced by numerous interacting factors, including food quantity, nutritional composition, meal timing, exercise timing and intensity, sleep hours and quality, continuous emotional stress, hydration, medications, environmental conditions, acute illness, pain, minor injuries, constipation, skin irritation, infections, and many other physiological events. Some factors are predictable, whereas others arise unexpectedly during daily life. Even seemingly insignificant events may temporarily alter blood pressure within 1 minute or glucose levels within 5 to 15 minutes. Living physiology is far more complicated than any engineering control system I have ever studied and designed. Therefore, I do not attempt to control my TSI-Stroke3B directly. Instead, I attempt to influence these three primary pathophysiological variables that ultimately determine it. I select healthier foods, reduce portion sizes, exercise every day after meal, obtain adequate sleep, maintain proper hydration, practice breathing exercises, and deliberately avoid unnecessary emotional stress, people, events, or issues whenever possible. These lifestyle decisions influence my blood glucose and systolic blood pressure, which in turn influence the long-term trajectory of my TSI-Stroke3B. Even then, I know I can never achieve perfect control. In fact, I do not believe in the concept of perfection in this world. Human pathophysiology is simply too complex. Living systems are highly nonlinear, continuously adapting, and constantly responding to both external environmental influences and internal pathophysiological changes. From a systems engineering perspective, I have gradually learned that I am not controlling the output itself. Rather, I am influencing the inputs that govern the input variables. The TSI-Stroke3B value then becomes the natural consequence of how successfully the entire physiological system has been managed. When I lower the numerical values of my various lifestyle factors, my 3 input biomarkers also decrease. As these 2 or 3 input biomarkers decline, the output TSI-Stroke3B follows the same concave downward trajectory. Consequently, the accumulated stroke risk energy, the integration of output and 3 inputs, is progressively reduced, moving the system farther below that threshold associated with stroke occurrence. This realization may be one of the most important lessons I have learned during my 17-year biomedical research journey. Engineering taught me how to understand systems. Medicine taught me that human living systems can only be influenced, never completely controlled. This is part 1.